So, what really decisively hooked me was a group of books that I read the first vacation uh, away from Oxford in Christmas 1966. And the book that hooked me was Dieu d'eau in translation as Conversations with Olga Tamelli by Marcel Criol. If I were to look at a moment, that was what hooked me. And I'd had some problems coming to terms with the Durkheimianism in the department because I thought I was an existentialist. And so I had to to reconcile the contradiction between such decisions as whether or not to drown my cats in the River Seine and a doctrine which indicated that even the most individual-looking of actions had a social cause. So it was a slow and painful conversion to the doctrines of the année sociologique, which were gospel in the University of Oxford. When I did better than I expected to do, but not brilliantly, in the examinations in July 67 in anthropology, not as well as Harriet had done the year before, I scraped by the skin of my teeth a state studentship to continue. And I think I'd have gone to London to work with Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf had not Oxford had one of its applicants turn it down. So I ended up with two possible theses. They couldn't be further apart. One of them was on racism, on the race relations and the origin of scientific racism. The other was on Aztec and Maya cosmology, and particularly Nahuatl cosmology. For that, Needham was prepared to supervise. But that lasted only 4 weeks, because he insisted on a chapter at the end of 4 weeks, and when I explained that I didn't think I could do much more without learning Nahuatl, and there was nobody to teach me in Nahuatl in Oxford, he said, that's your problem. So we ended up parting, and I ended up with the Rhodes Professor of Race Relations, whose MA was in anthropology. He'd never taken a PhD, but he had written a book in colonial history. A South African who never read my thesis, but was encouraging to me in various ways, because he realized I had a very little ego. And he was a mildly anti-apartheid South African who occupied a chair of race relations by courtesy of the Rhodes Foundation. His very title, Rhodes Professor of Race Relations, was oxymoronic, which any Africanist will appreciate, as Cecil Rhodes was the worst of the lot in terms of imperialism. So, I ended up doing something on the rise and fall in scientific racism in anthropology. This was a non-fieldwork doctorate, something very unusual, and I went straight through without the first thesis, which Harriet had to do, and it was non-fieldwork because Oxford, in the immediate post-colonial era, had lost all sense of how to get its students to the field. And it was also a period when ethnography, for some strange reason, among the students, not among the faculty, was out of fashion. You wrote histories of theory, and if you did anything, you would obviously reproduce Dumézil and Lévi-Strauss, who didn't really have to do much field work. Right? Of course, there was Dumont, who did a lot of field work, but never mind. Anyway, I somehow got the degree. We had meanwhile accepted work at Kent State University, a place in the American Midwest that we never heard of, but we responded. What happened is I got over there on a so-called British teacher scheme operated by the Woodrow Wilson Foundation and the English-speaking Union. And we were assigned to teach anthropology in Ohio, in a university where 4 students were shot at an anti-war demonstration in the months between our appointment and our arriving. So in that first year, we were at a campus visited by Joan Baez, Allen Ginsberg, Jane Fonda, and Phillips. And we were in the middle of a political storm. We were also in a very foreign culture. Foreign to us both as a New Yorker in Harriet's case and as a Brit in mine. A very different university which was very non-elitist, and an anthropology which could not be more distant from the anthropology we had learned. Boasian trait collection or neo-evolutionism, depending on whose course you took. No sympathy at all with French structuralism, with British structuralism. Give me the facts. Where are the facts here? Our last class, we learned about water witching and how it's done, and not about this la-di-da stuff about symbolic opposition. Well, I got a job after I got a teaching award. The position expired and I had no job. I quickly found that with a teaching award and no publications, you would have a job finding work. Well, anyway, Harriet found work at the University of Massachusetts and later at Smith College. I found work at Rutgers University in Newark. And this was another contrasting experience. This was a ghetto school near New York City with an administration that looked down on its students and whom the students hated. And the faculty were mostly interested in their own publication and trying to convince themselves that they were really at Columbia. Despite that, the students probably got a fairly good education, but it was a commuter campus, and you had to seek your intellectual community outside it. Meanwhile, the lack of fieldwork was becoming an obvious problem to both of us. And we got busy on the first of 2 projects that were to occupy us many years. One friend we'd made in New York City, who later decided he hated us for reasons we never found out, was a student of Evans, Pritchard and Needham, who is still alive. He's about 85. He's Tom Beidelman. Beidelman was an enthusiastic ethnographer, still is, I suppose, and he lived and breathed Africa. One day when we were there, he showed us some pamphlets he'd actually bought in Greenwich Village because he hadn't been to Nigeria. And these were pamphlets produced by ordinary people, authored by ordinary people who had secondary school education, rarely university education, produced by local presses, not more than 30 pages long, for ordinary people who had just graduated high school. And these were pamphlets produced in what you might call broken English for people, by people whose second language was English, for people whose second language was English, and perhaps were in the first generation of literacy. They were comparable. These are the so-called Onitsha market pamphlets, and they named after the town on the Niger, the Igbo town on the Niger where they were produced. And they were like the English chapbooks of the 17th century. Some of them were on political topics. The story of Patrice Lumumba, how John Kennedy lived and died for his nation. Proverbs and other important things. No condition is permanent. How to escape money-monger girls. That's the kind of range they covered. Could we cover something like this? I got a summer grant, and we went over to visit Onitsha. But we never got that far because my wife had an accident in the street and ended up in hospital, and we stayed in the city we'd ended up in, Benin City. You could occasionally get pamphlets there, but we got detoured into something else because we realized that television was filling the space of the market pamphlets, which were already beginning to disappear. And we came back in the 80s to do a project on both television and other media in Nigeria. In both, meanwhile, after Harriet published on clitoridectomy, we realized something. She had used my race thesis to look at some 19th century attitudes towards circumcision and clitoridectomy by racists such as Sir Richard Burton. And we realized there was a convergence of interests, that a lot of racial stereotypes were also sexual stereotypes. And we could speak of that later on. So two projects got going at the same time. A book on the history of sexuality within anthropology, and the Nigeria project. We put in for funding for the Nigeria project in the middle of doing the Sexuality project, not expecting to get any funding, because we'd never get any funding. And then it came through. A strategic grant from Shirk to study mass media in Nigeria. Stopping over in London to pick up a shortwave radio before embarking, we met an old friend of mine in advertising. I always thought you were a straight and honest guy, he said, but now I realize you're just like me in advertising. You mean you've got a grant from the Canadian government that's supposedly strategic to go over and watch Nigerians watching television. This is the biggest skive I've ever heard of. So this is, if I can go away from this, this is the problem with both the projects. The Nigeria project occupied us for about 10 years, and then we went back to the sex project. But we had a problem with both, that a lot of anthropologists and a lot of people outside anthropology particularly don't regard the study of sexuality as something serious. It's slightly smutty, it's frivolous, it's Margaret Mead and a whole lot of people dancing around in grass skirts. That's not serious. It's women's stuff, and therefore it's not serious. It's just pure titillation. We got that from an anthropologist at Rutgers. If you're not careful, said one anthropologist and archaeologist we knew, you'll get the same reputation as the birds. Harriet responded, well, we won't mind that reputation. And then the president of Harriet's university, having read that she'd published on clitoridectomy, said, we'll all have to watch our crotches when we come into the room with you. So the sexuality research was taken not very seriously, and the television research nobody took seriously, even though we managed to put in a lot of fashionable theory. We were very concerned with that because we were some of the first people to bring in Frankfurt School and cultural studies into looking at media. And the problem with that work was too early. But that's a bit of background. But one thing I have to stress, and this is something that cannot be said too emphatically as we get into our joint research, was, by the way, the race stuff, I never got much out. I had no idea how to I knew how to write a thesis, but I was not trained. And this is one problem with Britain. They don't train you in writing term papers, in writing publishable essays, or they didn't in those days. And how to go about publishing was something you got no education in. Rantsmanship you got no education in. We had to train ourselves. But so a lot of the stuff I did on race never got directly published. Some of it later appeared in the book. But meanwhile, the 80s, by the end of the 80s, we were at least theoretically embarked. We were embarked on two projects, and we were publishing mainly on the material on Nigeria, because obviously fieldwork is what's done first. But that's all, by the way, of some background. I've talked enough about myself, but we'll be talking about ourselves for now. And now, if you excuse me, I disappear again, and I'm done with this particular segment. We can talk about ourselves.
Yep.